How's it going, guys? I'm Robert from Machado Visuals, and here's a quick lighting breakdown from a cooking show I recently DP'd out in LA. We were at 2010 Studios, which has a standing kitchen set and is an amazing space that was designed to capture food. All right, so you've all seen a typical cooking show. We have a few contestants, a running clock, and the best dish wins. Same concept applies here, and we have one chef judging a specific dish, and whoever wins gets to move on for another shot at a cash prize. When I'm dealing with a project of this scale, I always like breaking everything down into an overhead diagram because it gives me a chance to thoughtfully think through how light will affect the space, and then I'm able to share that with my team so that they can start developing some spatial awareness as well. The main challenge with any studio set is that you have to create everything from scratch and light for the area. So I started with figuring out where I wanted to put my key. I wanted to leave a little bit of contrast on our talent so that we weren't just blasting the set with light. So we cross-keyed using the IntelliTech Mega Light Cloth by setting them slightly off-axis from the contestants' tables so that it would just ever so wrap around the face while they stand at their food station. Cross-keying is pretty much my go-to lighting setup whenever I'm shooting multiple subjects so that you can shoot into the shadow side and create a little bit of contrast in the face. Usually with cross-key lighting, your key light also acts as the other person's backlight, but I was worried that that would have been too strong since whoever's standing underneath the fixture would be much closer than who it's really intended for. So we added egg grates to the lights to help contain some of that spill. Another option would have been to use some sort of bottomer or net to shave off some of that intensity, but the egg crate was a much easier solution, so we just went with that. Towards the front of the set, we mounted two sky panels in the sky with the large chimeras as a really soft fill at around 60%. When you're working in a studio space, it's really important to think of your ambient levels. If we had just stuck with the key and fill, our talent would have still looked great, but it would have looked like they're cooking in a kitchen with the lights turned off. So to help lift the room, we sent a 600D with the F10 Fresnel through one of the windows to give a very subtle dapple across the back wall. I love utilizing hard light whenever I can because it's something we constantly see in real life, and to me, it helps reinforce that suspension of disbelief. Not everything has to be soft and beautiful. For me, it's much more about feeling natural and organic.
Rob, what did you do?
Did my job.
Why is there another 2 squares?
Because I did my job.
Did you sneak another 2 cameras in?
No, I just did my job.
Right above the window was another 600X with the lantern attachment to help fill in that area, and we also added a small teaser to help keep it off our talent while they're at their stations. We also mounted Asteras on one of the set walls to boost our ambience and also use as a hair light. I had originally thought of using honey crates on the tubes, but I actually didn't mind it spilling all over the walls, and it actually ended up maximizing our intensity. For the kitchen practicals, we swapped those bulbs with the B7Cs at around 4000 Kelvin to give a little bit of warmth to the scallop patterns that you sometimes see on the wall, and also peppered in a bunch of MCs in the open air fridge to give a little bit more detail on those ingredients, and just swapped out the units to charge in between episodes. In terms of cameras, there were a lot. To start off, there were 5 FX9s on the floor, 1 jib, 1 following our host, 1 following talent, another following talent, and then another roaming to capture super tight details. And on top of that, we mounted 4 FX3s overhead on the grid to capture the food stations and the stove. The FX3s are obviously a much better solution over something like a GoPro because it instantly overheats when it's mounted to the hood vent, and it's far too wide to capture the food station. We used dual lock to sandwich a Blackmagic HDMI converter on top of the camera so we could run a longer SDI cable to monitor each feed and verify camera settings. I also used these Anchor USB chargers with dual USB-C and power delivery so we could power both the camera and the converter box with just one USB brick. To trigger the cameras, we used these individual Sony remotes so that we could wirelessly start recording without having to get up on a ladder each time. Most of the cameras were on a Sony 70-200, so everyone had plenty of reach without having to impede on someone else's shot. All of the camera feeds were sent into a decimator, which is a little device that takes up to 12 SDI inputs and displays it over a single output. So we ran that to my monitor on set and then out to another monitor in Video Village. I rated everything at 500 EI, and everyone knows Cine EI is a little bit quirky because of how it treats ISO as an exposure index. For those that might not know, Sony cameras will always record at its base ISO. meaning that if you're changing your ISO willy-nilly, your footage is going to have all kinds of exposure differences because, again, it's always recording at base ISO. My workaround for this is selecting S-Log3 as my monitor LUT and then going into my settings and baking in that monitor LUT into the internal recording. Essentially, I'm baking in S-Log3 as a look file so that when I change my exposure index in camera, that change will be reflected in the recorded file, which helps the editor and colorist so that they don't have to spend a bunch of time correcting a bunch of different exposures. The only downside of this is that the Sony viewfinder will only be able to show you logs since that's technically what you're selecting as your monitor LUT. So I made sure to get onboard monitors for all my operators so that they could monitor with a clean feed with the LUT applied. If you're still unfamiliar with how CineEI works on Sony cameras, I recommend checking out one of my recent videos where I explain it with the FX3.
That's okay. We got the rest of the team here. They're doing amazing things. And of course, here, you know what? Turn, look at this. Turn this around right here. There you go. That's the man right there. That's the man capturing all this glorious
I just try and help.
How you feeling today?
I feel good.
You feeling
I'm
good?
excited.
You feeling really, really good?
I'm pumped for the day. It's scary being in front of the camera, but I feel good right now.
Okay.
So I'm ready to get behind the camera now.
Perfect. All right, you're going to go behind the camera.
On another stage, we had another small kitchen setup where we shot the food being plated with a Sony FX6 on a Tokina 100mm macro. We needed a ton of light for a few reasons. One, we're doing food stuff, so I need to be able to stop down to a minimum of T8 to really capture that detail and avoid turning everything into mush at that focal length. Also, since we are using a macro, you can lose an additional 2 stops depending on how close the focus is. The elements end up being so deep within the bowels of the lens that you just start taking a hit on light transmission. 2, we're shooting 4K 120 so that you can really spend time and focus on all the fine details throughout the dish, so we needed over 4 times the light you'd normally use. And 3, I was using a rotating polarizer in the matte box, which takes away another 1.5 stops. Basically, we needed a ton of light, so I pulled out the biggest fixture I own, which was the 1200D with the Light Dome 150 for a beautifully soft directional key. We set up another 1200D across the room going through an 8x quarter grid to help bring back some ambience, and another 200X going through a window to give a little bit of texture and warmth to the wall. Since we're on the FX6, I used the high base 12800 and rated down at 3200 EI for a really clean image at a higher ISO. Oftentimes I'll rate downwards like this for a much cleaner result if I ever have to shoot past ISO 800. Having rotopoly inside the matte box was also super important so that you're able to dial in the reflections and specular highlights while also enhancing the food's color. By just adjusting the polarizer, you're able to cut through the really offensive highlights for a really rich image. To top things off, I threw in a little bit of scarf dust to give a little bit of warmth to some of the blooming. Both of these filters are available from Revar Cine, and if you're interested, you can get 10% off with my code, Is That a Red? I'm not sponsored by them, I just think it's a funny code. I really wanted to go with a more traditional macro setup as opposed to something like a probe lens because I wanted these food shots to be presented with much more polish so that they look as appetizing as possible. In my opinion, the wider focal length and extremely close focus on the probe lens is great at making objects appear larger than life, but ultimately that wasn't the look I was going for. Plus, it's still a fairly wide lens and the field of view would not have been very conducive to our very small set. The last setup I want to talk about is the Confessional, and we did something similar to the dating show I shot earlier this year. We went with a very basic beauty light setup using a 300D on a mini light dome that was clamped onto the ceiling since we had to position the light pretty much right overhead talent to get that really soft overhead key. And we also used a silver balance card for a little bit of added return to help tighten up that ratio. I would have preferred having a larger key to soften up the source a little bit more, but we were in such a small space that we really didn't have room for much else. We used another 300X on the spotlight mount to scatter a really subtle blue texture over the background and ping a couple of specular highlights, and finally snuck another Astera up in a corner to cast a similar violet hue. We shot all these wide open on the 51.2 G Master, and I rarely ever shoot anything wide open, but I just wanted to throw the background completely out of focus, and I had full faith in the camera's autofocus. That was pretty much it. There were a ton of moving parts, but we had such an amazing crew that it was probably one of the smoothest jobs that I've had all year. One small thing that I didn't take into account were all the kitchen appliances that needed to be powered during the show, but we were able to balance out all the circuits thanks to our gaffer Chris and his best boy Sam. Everyone down to the PAs were just super chill and super good at their job. Shout out to Max and Mitchell, by the way. Hopefully this video was helpful in some way. It's super interesting seeing how Sony's cinema line ends up being wildly different, but at the same time complementing each other in just the right ways. The FX9 was super versatile with the different sensor scan modes so that our jib was able to run a Canon servo lens that doesn't quite cover full frame. The FX6 was excellent for its high speed capability and flawless autofocus in the confessional room, and the FX3 was the perfect size to rig as a high quality overhead camera. It's super nice having cameras that blend seamlessly with one another and pick up where the others leave off. It was also super great being in LA again and working with such a phenomenal crew, not to mention all the incredible food we got to experience all week. If you enjoyed this video, I'm doing a more detailed project breakdown over on Patreon, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
1, 2, 3, 4.